Hey guys, so I'm very excited about today's lecture, especially because this is one of my favorite one, and the reason is I end up using this feature from es6 the most. In fact, one of the most interesting new parts of es6 is arrow functions, and as the name arrow functions suggests, it is defined with a new syntax that uses an arrow. But arrow functions behave differently than traditional JavaScript functions in a number of important ways. And let me highlight those before we jump into what the actual practicality is. So let me just give you the theory so you can relate to me when I give you the examples. So the first thing is there's no use of this super arguments new dot target bindings in the arrow functions. The arrow functions cannot be called with the new parameter, which means they do not have the construct method and therefore cannot be used as constructors. Now, the arrow functions do not even have a prototype. Of course, it will not be, because as you do not have the new keyword that you can use with arrow functions, the prototype makes no sense to be there with the arrow functions. Now, you cannot also change the this parameter. The value of this inside the arrow function cannot be changed. It remains the same throughout the entire life cycle of the function. Then you also don't have the arguments object. So in the previous lectures, we have seen that by default, you get the arguments in es5 etc or es6 functions, but for arrow functions there's no arguments at all. The other thing is no duplicate named parameters. So in the traditional functions you can have named parameters which have the same name, but in arrow functions cannot have duplicate name parameters in strict or non-strict mode, as opposed to non-arrow functions that can have duplicate name parameters in strict mode. So these were some of the differences that I want to highlight, and probably we'll see some examples too. But I just want you to understand that the arrow functions are really very powerful, and trust me, if you're using React, you will love it. And I've not yet used Angular, but I'm sure it will be used pretty much out there, because it's actually the JavaScript framework that we're using. So arrow functions are super important. I hope you understand them very clearly and very thoroughly, and make sure you do, because this will solve a lot of problems in your life related to functions. Now, why were these differences created in arrow functions? Why arrow functions were created so differently? There are multiple reasons for it. In fact, the first and the foremost reason is this binding is a common source of errors in JavaScript. Now, it's very easy to lose track of what this variable is inside functions, which can result in unintended behavior for the program. And arrow functions eliminates this confusion completely. The second reason, by limiting arrow functions to simply executing the code which with a single this value JavaScript, engines can more easily optimize these operations, unlike regular functions which might be used as a constructor or otherwise modified. Now, the rest of the differences are focused on reducing errors and ambiguities inside the arrow functions. By doing so, JavaScript engines are better able to optimize the arrow functions execution. Now, also make a point of note that arrow functions also have a name parameter or the name property that we talked earlier in the lectures. So and also the same rules apply to it. So let's quickly see the syntax for arrow functions. The syntax for arrow function, of course, as the name suggests, it should contain an arrow. Now, all variables or all variations begins with the function arguments followed by the new arrow or the arrow that we have. So as you can see, the first example I have out here, which is a normal function called reflect, and it has a function, it has a value, it returns a value. So the way we will write this function is very easy. What we will do is we'll say variable reflect. Of course, I cannot duplicate, but it's variable, so it may work. Value and then arrow and then the value. That's it. That's all you need to do for an arrow function. So you can see this one line is equivalent to this 3 lines. All the variations begin with the function arguments followed by the arrow followed by the body of the function. Now, both the arguments and the body of the function can be different forms depending on the usage that you want. Now, when there is only one argument for an arrow function, which is like in this case value, that one argument can be used directly without any further syntax. The arrow comes next, and the expression to the right is basically evaluated and returned. Now, even though there's no explicit return statement, this arrow function will return the first argument that is passed in. Now, if you're passing in more than one arguments, then in this scenario, like in the second example, number 1 and number 2, you're passing 2 arguments. In this scenario, you will use parentheses. So let me show you this example too. So we'll do variable sum is equals to, now you have number 1 and number 2, so you'll do number 1 comma number 2. So these are your parameters. You just put the arrow function, and now in the return, what we will do is we'll just do a number 1 plus number 2, and that's it. So all you're doing in these three lines can be summed up into this one line, where you can just have the parameters number 1, number 2, and you can of course return the number 1, number 2 as well. Now the function simply adds two arguments together and returns the result. Now the only difference between this one and the reflect function that we saw above is that the parameters are enclosed in a bracket or parenthesis, as we say. Just like the traditional functions have the parameters where you can give everything in the bracket, it is the same. Now if there are no arguments to the function, let's say in this scenario where you just have a get name and it just returns Abhay, in this case you have no arguments. So what will we do is we just do a get name and equals to, so if there are no parameters that you need to pass to a function, you'll just do an empty parenthesis arrow, and once you do the arrow, all you have to do is the name, which is in this scenario Abhay. That's it. So if there are no parameters or no arguments that you're passing, in that scenario you'll just give an empty parenthesis. Now one thing to note, we've already seen 3 examples of arrow functions. Now there is the important thing. Let's say if you have more than one expression, these just had one lines and you had to write more than one expression. So the way you write it is you treat this, anything which is after the arrow is pretty much your body. So you can simply write this one. Let me just comment it and show it to you in another approach, where we can just do the same thing and copy everything which is here into there. So what I mean to say is the body is actually the same that it can be in the traditional function. Well, there is an exception that the arguments object is not available in arrow functions. So keep that subtle difference in mind. Now moving on, let's say you have something which is an anonymous function that you have, or do nothing function as we say. Now if you want to create such a function, all you have to do is you have to do a variable do nothing is equals to, of course, no parameters, so empty brackets, and an arrow, and of course no body, so just empty curly brackets will do the job. So this is as good as writing an anonymous function that you may want to use. Now curly braces are used to denote the function's body, which works just fine in the cases you have seen so far. But arrow functions that want to return an object literal, in that scenario it may get difficult. So the way you can do it is, so let's say you have a get temp item as an input, which id is input, and you return an object which is an object with the key value pair. In this scenario you cannot just return the object, because if you return the object it has its own brackets. Now to avoid that, what we do is we add parentheses. So let me give you an example. Let's say where variable get temp item is equals to id, and we can just add the parentheses. id is id comma name is temp. So that should be it. What this will indicate is that you're trying to return an object because everything is enclosed in the parentheses. I think that was a good enough lecture on arrow functions. We'll continue the discussion a little more in the future lecture, but I hope you practice this and probably try to convert all your functions, or probably whatever you've been practicing so far, into an arrow function and see how much you can gain out of it, because using arrow functions effectively will add a lot of value to your JavaScript knowledge. I'll see you in the next class.